The silence is broken by somebody crying, trying to be heard, never a word. Always the attitude, sort out your own, always alone, wishing for something the world is denying. Out in the wilderness somebody's crying.
Hello, this is Ayana Young, and I welcome you to For the Wild podcast. Today we are speaking with Eriel Deranger, who is an Indigenous rights advocate and member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, Treaty 8 of Northern Alberta, Canada. She works to raise awareness about the negative climate, human, and Indigenous rights impacts of the extractive industry in her nation's traditional lands and territory. Eriel is a founder of Indigenous Climate Action, a national Indigenous civil society vehicle to push for a united Indigenous climate action strategy in Canada. Eriel has worked with various Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations, including the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, Indigenous Environmental Network, Sierra Club, Rainforest Action Network, and the UN Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. She is married and a mother of two and currently resides in Edmonton, Alberta. Well, welcome, Eriel. I am so excited to be speaking with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Eriel, to start us off with a sense of place, I'd love if you could tell us a bit about your ancestral lands and the territories of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations.
Yeah, for sure. So I come from a place in northern Canada, so Treaty 8. Now, the Treaty 8 territory is quite expansive and extensive. It's actually the largest recognized numbered treaty area in Canada. But I come from an area that exists within northern Alberta. So we live within what's known as the Peace Athabasca Delta. And the Peace Athabasca Delta is right in sort of the heart of the boreal forest, and it's a delta, so it's a lot of water, a lot of river systems, and an immense amount of boreal forest. The delta is also home to one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which is the Wood Buffalo National Park. And so our territory has already been recognized not just nationally, but internationally for its rich biodiversity that exists within our territory. But just sort of upstream from our territory is the largest industrial project in the world, which is the Alberta tar sands. So sort of right in the hub of this beautiful biodiversity that is home to, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the traditional territory of my people, the Dene Sutune people, is this massive industrial project producing some of the dirtiest fuel on the planet. And it's not just about the river systems and the flora and the fauna and the plants, but there's also an immense impact on species. So we used to have some of the richest herds of caribou and bison, and now we have very small bison herds and very small caribou herds. In fact, the decline that we've seen in our region in the last 30 years is a 70 to an 80% decline in the numbers of these species from industrial disturbances to their lands and territory. So it's still beautiful. We still have a lot of rich boreal forests and swamplands and peat bogs and river systems and places where we go fishing and hunting and trapping. But it's all sort of being degraded right now from this massive industrial project just upstream from our communities.
It's difficult to even fathom the scope. 10.6 million acres, which is roughly the size of Florida. So I'm wondering if you would mind giving us a picture of what this highly destructive giga project looks like. Then if you could tell us about the process itself.
For sure. So I think a good way to visualize what our territory looks like, and I actually just sort of stumbled upon this recently. I was at an event with a friend of mine who's from Peru. He's at one of the headwaters of the Amazon River, and he was showing me pictures of his territory. And so many people in the world, when we talk about sort of rich biodiversity, we think of the Amazon immediately, and we see all these beautiful pictures of these rivers snaking through forests and beautiful landscapes that are uninhabited by people. that is what my territory looks like. In fact, as we put pictures side by side of our territories, if you were looking at them directly from above, you couldn't ascertain which was which. And so that was a really, really sort of one of those stark moments for me where I was like, oh, when we talk about the lungs of the earth and we make these references to the boreal forest being the second half of the other sides of the lungs of the earth, that reference is actually quite accurate, not just as a metaphor, but as a visualization of what they actually look like. And so we're talking about beautiful greenery, beautiful forests, beautiful river systems and lakes and animals and biodiversity that's so rich and so critical for life on Earth. And as you're looking at this space and its beauty and its immense, it seems to go on and on and on, you happen upon these massive pocks or sores on the earth. And from flying up above, the plains look like little tiny specks compared to the size of some of these operations. And these operations are done in multiple different ways. There isn't just sort of one way to access the oil. So traditional sweet crude oil that you see in like Texas and other oil-rich places, like even in the Middle East, it's pump jacks lined up everywhere, and it's very ugly and disturbing. But in our territory, it's quite different. It's not just pump jacks everywhere. What they actually have to do is they have to rip up the earth. They have to remove the boreal forest and that rich biodiversity. And they sort of roll it all up, like literally they collect the trees and the plants and they roll them all up and they put them away for what they refer to as intended reclamation in the future. And then they dig into the earth and they remove the top layers of soil and they take those away as well until they dig deep enough until they get to the bitumen or tar sands or oil sands. And, you know, there's the technical terms, there's the oil industry terms, and there's what they coined as the political activist terms, which is tar sands. But the reality is they referred to this as tar sands early on when they first discovered this because they thought it was tar, but then they realized that it was oil mixed with mud. And the consistency of it is more like peanut butter, which got its name, tar sands. And so they access this sort of muddy, oily soil, and then they dig it out and they create these massive open pit mines where they have some of the largest dump trucks on the planet and massive shovel operations digging into the ground, filling up these trucks. They're as big as a 2-story home. And they fill them up with dirt, and these shovel operations are running 24/7, 365 days a year, extracting this. Currently, we have about 600 square kilometers. I don't know in miles what that is, I apologize, but 600 square kilometers of land that's being dug up and open pit mines that cover 600 square kilometers of land in Northern Alberta. And it's not just the operations that are these sort of giant pocks on the land of just the operations themselves of these open pit mines. But in order to process the tar sands and turn it into oil or something that resembles an oil similar to sweet crude oil, it's not just your standard ship it in a pipeline. They have to separate all that mud and sand from this muddy substance. And they do it by using massive amounts of water that they take directly from the freshwater river systems in the territory, the Athabasca River System, the Mackenzie Athabasca Basin, which is a glacier-fed water source, one of the cleanest, should be one of the cleanest water sources in North America, but that's also ailing now because of this industry. But they take fresh water and then they put it into these systems where they superheat it and they mix it with this sort of muddy oil, and then they spin it until the oil separates from the mud. And then they take this leftover toxic cocktail of minerals and oils and contamination from the mud and the separation and all the leftover water that they've used, and they put them into these things that they refer to now as tailings ponds. But these tailings ponds are not ponds. They're more like lakes, and now they encompass an area close to 300 square kilometers of land. So you get to see from an aerial perspective these giant mines that are covering over 600 kilometers of land and an additional, I think it's around 280 square kilometers of toxic lakes of water and the byproducts. But we also have mounds of pet coke, which is a toxic carcinogen. And some of these mounds of pet coke are literally on the shores of the river system. And then further back, even more, is another byproduct of the extraction process, which is sulfur. They now refer to these mounds as sulfur pyramids because they extract and they have all this sulfur as a byproduct, that they're creating these pyramids, very comparable to the pyramids of Egypt that are 7 stories high, and there are now 4 of them, that they just stack and stack and stack and stack sulfur. They're creating so much pet coke and so much sulfur that they can't even find markets large enough to purchase this from them. So we're talking about layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of contamination and destruction that you can visually see, that you can smell with your nose, that you can taste in your mouth, and that you can hear. Because one of the other things about this industry is that these ducks and other waterfowl, as they fly through the region, they'll sometimes mistake these tailings lakes for real lakes, because why wouldn't you? And they've had multiple instances where large flocks of waterfowl have landed in these toxic lakes and succumbed almost immediately. They're like modern day tar pits where these animals then sink to their death and die. And in 2008, a flock of 1,606 ducks flew through the region, landed on one of the lakes, and died. And so since then, now the operators are mandated to have deterrent systems, and they have these like scarecrows put on all these little boats in these lakes, and then they're firing these propane cannons every 2 to 5 seconds. It's just like poof, poof, poof. So you can hear it, you can taste it, you can smell it, and it leaves this visceral reaction in your soul almost, to go from this beauty of something that is reminiscent and looks like the Amazon rainforest, and you see these giant sores on the land that just hit you with a wave of every sensory system that you can have. And as an Indigenous person, it also hits your soul and your spirit, because these places are not just in the middle of nowhere. These are places that my father grew up in. These are places that I knew as a child that were sacred places where we would go fishing and trapping and hunting and for cultural procurement and practices that are now completely destroyed. I remember one of the times that I hadn't been there in a really many years, and I drove from the town of Fort McMurray, where there's just boreal forest, and then you go north of Fort McMurray and suddenly there's these massive operations. And I remember driving down that highway from Fort McMurray, and my family friend of ours was just yammering on about how big the industry's gotten since I'd been there, and it'd been about a decade. And as we pulled over this little hill and I could see it, I remember as she was just talking more and more about what was going on, I couldn't even hear her anymore because my ears just started ringing and my face got hot. And I was looking at this destruction and I felt my chest tighten, because it was like coming upon a dead relative. It was like coming upon something so awful and horrible to see that I couldn't breathe and I couldn't do anything. And I just remember tears are coming down my face, because for the first time in many years, it was like seeing someone dead laid out before me and everyone just walking past it. And so it's a really visceral experience to see that as an Indigenous person who was taught that those places are our relatives, that the birds and the fish are our relatives, that the trees and the grass and the plants and the medicine nurture us, and that these things are critical to our identity and who we are as people, to just be so blatantly destroyed and displayed in front of you with pride by this industry. And so for me, that's what the tar sands are. It's destruction in the heart of beauty and in the heart of the territory of my people. In the heart of my identity is this giant sore that people parade around with pride.
I pity the country, I pity the state, and the mind of a man who thrives on hate. Small are the lives of cheats and of liars, of bigoted news press, fascist town crier. Deception annoys me, Deception destroys me. The Bill of Rights throws me. In jails they all know me. Frustrated are churchmen, the saving of soul men, the tinker, the tailor, the colonial governor. They pull and they paw me. They're seeking to draw me away from the roundness of the light. Silly civil servants, they thrive off my body. Their trip is with power, back bacon and welfare. Police, they arrest me. Materialists to test me. Pollution, it chokes me. Movies, they joke me. Politicians exploit me. City life that jades me. Hudson Bay fleece me. Hunting laws freak me. Government is bumbling. Revolution's rumbling. To be ruled in impunity is tradition, continuity. I pity the country. I pity the state. And the mind of a man who thrives on hate.
Thank you so much for describing this personal heartbreak, this cultural heartbreak, and ecological heartbreak, and these toxic tailings ponds, which I'd heard now there's the largest lake of toxic water in the world in your region. On top of that, there's 110 to 350 gallons of fresh water for every barrel of oil that is produced, and that 82% of that water comes from the Athabasca River. It's threatening the life of the animals, the water, the soil, and people. From what I understand, some of the foundations of Trudeau's campaign when running for office was making Canada an international climate leader and to build nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations. And then additionally, there is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People and agreements such as Treaty 8 with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations that are supposed to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples when making decisions within their territories. So maybe you could tell us about the relationship First Nations have with the Canadian government and if they're honoring these declarations or treaties regarding pending tar sands developments.
Well, it's been just over a year since we've seen the election of the Trudeau government, sort of ending a decade of what I would refer to as Harperdom or conservative government, which not just nationally, but also locally and provincially in the province of Alberta, really sort of ushered in the state in which we're in with the rate and scale and pace of tar sands development. So we had a conservative government in the province of Alberta for 44 years, and in Canada, natural resources are regulated by the provinces. So if you have a conservative government that believes that this is the way forward, then that's what you're going to see provincially. And then nationally, we had Harper for about 12 years. So we had these very strong conservative governments that really degraded regulatory reform and paved the way for industry to be able to smoothly operate, not just provincially, but also nationally, because that's one of the things about this project is that when we talk about it being the largest industrial project on Earth, it's not just because of these immense areas and destruction of open pit mining and the other process is called in situ, which is kind of like fracking. So on top of all this big mining that we see, there's also in situ, which is a series of systems of pipes are put into the ground that superheat and super pressurize water and other diluents and chemicals to dissolve or melt the bitumen in the ground or in situ. And or steam-assisted gravity drainage is the other name for it. And then they have another series of pipelines below that sucks it up and then takes it into these another series of pipelines and then ships it to these either holding tanks or to refineries. It has a less of a more like topical visual on the ground, but the destruction below the earth is immense. And the series of pipelines and the sort of critical habitat that is disrupted for the construction of these things is crazy. And we have 144,000 square kilometers of land earmarked for in situ SAGD development. And so what's really interesting is that we've had these governments that have sort of welcomed and ushered in the tar sands development by degrading regulatory reform, by minimizing the royalties having to be paid by these industries, and also giving them huge tax benefits for operating in our region. And so Trudeau gets elected into the country with these promises of real progress and real progressive change and bold promises of regulatory reform, climate action, respect and implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. But it's been just over a year, and what have we seen? Not really a lot, particularly in the tar sands. What we've actually seen is that right now, the largest proposed open pit mine, the Teck Frontier mine, is up for approval. It made it through and sneaked past reform of regulatory review process, sanctioned by the provincial government and sanctioned by the federal government because it's under Canadian legislation. And it's set for public review in 2017. So for me, that's an indicator that not really a lot has changed. In addition to stuff in Alberta and tar sands, under Harper's, I don't want to say rule, but under the Trudeau government, what we've also seen is massive approvals of LNG, liquid natural gas, and fracked natural gas projects and pipelines being approved in the neighboring province of British Columbia. A highly contested mega dam called the Site C Hydro Dam in British Columbia also approved. And those actually have direct relations to Alberta's tar sands, because in order to power these operations of refining and in situ, they're looking for those energy sources to power the expansion of Alberta's tar sands. And that is going to come from things like liquid natural gas and mega hydro dams. That electricity will generate more power for the tar sands to operate. And so we see that this project and its immensity and why it's called the largest industrial project on the planet is because of the energy that it takes up and utilizes cleaner sources of energy like liquid natural gas, which is bad in itself, but it's still cleaner burning than tar sands, as well as hydroelectric energy, which is, considered sustainable, but there's lots of contesting around that as well. All the pipelines that are associated with the development of it to ship this to other ports on the northeast, southwest shores of the continent of North America, and also the diluents and the solvents that are being utilized to produce and extract this resource being pumped in to Alberta. And you begin to understand why this is so immense. And yet we're seeing no real action being taken by the Trudeau government that has made all these bold promises of regulatory reform and a slowdown of these expansions of these industries. And we're just seeing more and more approvals. I mean, pipelines. Yes, there was the removal and the denial of an application for the Northern Enbridge pipeline, which was heavily contested by many, many, many First Nations communities, as well as non-First Nations communities and municipalities. But when he denied that pipeline, he approved two others. And so we're seeing that the Kinder Morgan pipeline and Line 9 pipelines are both being approved. And these are green lights to the industry to keep expanding. And provincially, outside of Trudeau, we also have in the province of Alberta, the New Democrat Party, which is supposed to be a left-leaning government, also making very similar promises to Trudeau around, regulatory reform, rights recognition, climate action. And yet what we've seen from this industry is They've put a cap on tar sands emissions of 100 megatons per year. But right now, tar sands only equates about 70 megatons per year. So they're allowing a 30% increase in development of tar sands at a time when Indigenous communities are standing up across the country, across the territory, saying that we can't afford more projects. And to add insult to injury, they're like, yep, well, we hear what you're saying, but we're going to allow the largest open pit mine project, Tech Frontier Mine Project, to go through the regulatory process just to see what we all think should happen. For me, nothing's changed. It's business as usual. No real changes have come about. There's a lot of lip service being spouted by provincial governments and federal governments alike. And we now have Trump in the United States, who is saying, let's bring the Keystone XL pipeline back to life. So now we have multiple pipelines sending a green light to the industry in my territory that it's business as usual. Don't worry, we're going to get your oil to market, even though we're saying we need to be stopping the expansion of these projects. We need to be moving to better fuel sources and sustainable energy. And most importantly for us is we need to be developing both energy and economic paradigms that respect and uphold and affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples as per the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because I want my children to know what it means to be Dene. I want my children to know what the Athabasca Delta is. And the way that we're going now, I don't know where we're going to be in 20 years.
So what I'm hearing is the colonial oppressive history of North America is still going strong in Canada and is attempting to silence Indigenous voices. When Indigenous peoples are, quote, consulted, the destruction always happens anyways. So would you mind shedding some light on what the environmental assessment process is really like for the First Nations? And let's just start there. What is the environmental assessment process really like?
So, there's constantly this sort of rhetoric that gets touted by Canadian government officials that we have some of the best environmental standards and regulations in the world. Now, it's just simply not true. I mean, if that were true, would we legalize and allow mounds of pet coke to sit along the shores of a critical river system that's protected under the National Navigable Protection Act? Would we allow massive amounts of uncovered sulfur to be just sort of left in open air, and so on and so forth, for all of these destructive things associated with the tar sands? I mean, that simply would not be the case if we had real environmental protection and regulations in this country. So within the actual regulatory process, what we see is there's all these regulations that industry is supposed to meet around the expulsion of toxic contaminants into river systems and protection of species and air quality and all these things. Now, the biggest issue is that in Alberta's tar sands, how could they get away with all these things then? Well, they've done something that's very interesting. They've sort of created small applications for big projects. So instead of looking at multiple projects in one condensed area, because that's what's going on, they look at individual projects. So you'll have maybe 8 different operations back to back to back to back, one against the other. Some of them are owned by the same company, but they give them different names. Or it's multiple companies that have traded lease sites and done so, and then they all sort of operate in the same region. And they submit their applications to all those different areas and regulations, whether it's species at risk, whether it's fisheries, whether it's, emissions control, or, there's multiple different areas which they're supposed to abide by. But what happens when you start to look at smaller projects is that their impacts are what they refer to as negligible, or they don't impact because it's so small, it's so minute that they're going to allow 100 gallons of wastewater into the Athabasca River system. That's negligible with the rate and pace of the river system. It'll just dilute. But the problem is that it's not just one project. It's 6 projects all dumping thousands and thousands of gallons of wastewater into the river system, or disrupting thousands of hectares of land, or increasing emissions by 50 to 60 megatons per year. And you end up seeing a different picture when you come macro. And so what we've seen with regulations is that they're very micro, and you can't see the bigger picture, and you can't see those impacts. And then to add insult to injury for Indigenous folks, there is absolutely no review of how these projects impact treaty and Aboriginal rights in the country. They don't look at how that project is going to disrupt the traditional fishing of a community. It's not required, at least. And the only way that it is required is if a First Nation community or an Indigenous community steps in and says, hey, actually, that project is going to disrupt our fishing. And instead of going, oh, okay, that's great, we'll make sure we amend it and we'll figure that out, government and industry then say, okay, that's nice, prove it. It's literally the burden of proof is then put onto these communities. Now, we're being asked to do this in systems against governments and against corporations that both have billions of dollars and resources to be able to challenge any argument that we bring forward. So we will bring forward these, stories from our communities, oral history, will bring maps of where we've been and what we're doing in these different places. And they will do everything that they can to challenge the accuracy and the credibility of those pieces of evidence that we bring forward. And then when we do bring forward evidence that's unrefutable for the impacts on our treaty and Aboriginal rights, they don't actually really do much about it except relegate the corporations into a process of mediation with the First Nations. So instead of being like, oh, this project impacts these First Nations too much, you will not get permission to do so, they'll say to the company, well, your project clearly impacts the rights of this First Nation. You must now enter into a process of remediation and mediation with this proponent of the First Nation and figure out a way to come to an agreement to mitigate these impacts. And that has resulted in very little. It's resulted in, for instance, one company has created something called a reclamation lake. So they were going to destroy a critical fishing ground along the river system. And so they're like, oh, yeah, I guess we're going to probably impact that. It won't be safe to fish there anymore. So we're just going to go into a totally random part of the boreal forest. We're going to dig a lake. We're going to take water from the river system. We're going to put it in there. We're going to take some of the fish from the river and we're going to put it in this lake as well. And then that will be your reclamation fishing area. And that's where you can go to fish now because we've destroyed the other one. Now you can imagine most people don't go fishing there because one, it's not a traditional place to fish. And secondarily, the fish survival rate for that lake, not reclamation, compensation lake is what it was called. This compensation lake is not actually being effective in compensating, and its mitigations capabilities are negligible at best. And so we end up with these systems that, while they have all of these sort of check marks that they can check off for sort of Western society environmental standards, they're looking at them micro, so they're not even really effectively looking at them properly because it needs to be looked at cumulatively, and it's not. There's no real system in place to review effectively the impacts on treaty and Aboriginal rights unless First Nations people can come up with the money, the time, the resources to find out and to prove to these companies and to government that they are impacting their rights, that they're impacting things. And sometimes it's abstract, like, how do you prove that increased emissions and particulate matter from a company that's 85 kilometers away is increasing respiratory diseases in your community? How can you prove that the increases of cancer are associated directly to a company? Because it's not one company, it's all of them. All of the emissions are increasing respiratory diseases. It's not one corporation. It's not one project. And so you end up in this situation where we're like, well, we have increases in respiratory diseases, we have increases in cancer and autoimmune diseases. And we bring that to a hearing or a regulatory review process, and it's dismissed as evidence because there's no way to prove that it has any association because it's an individual application rather than a cumulative application. So there's serious problems within the regulatory review process. in recognizing the cumulative impacts as well as the impacts to treating Aboriginal rights.
The way that this toxic culture treats Earth is the same way that it treats women. And I'd like to discuss how this influx of labor coming from this huge project is affecting your communities. According to the Native Women's Association of Canada, there have been over 1,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women between 1980 and 2012. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the man camps and their contributions to these numbers.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that doesn't get enough attention, because within the research on the murdered and missing women sort of portfolio is you actually see clusters of where women go missing, and they're sort of in these industrial hubs of the country, including in Alberta. So obviously large urban centers like Vancouver and Toronto have a large number because of population numbers, but in places where you see massive resource development, you see sort of a incompatible number of missing and murdered women for the population sizes. And that's very true in Alberta. One of the most alarming things is at Fort Chipewyan, where my community is from. It's a small hamlet. It's an isolated rural community. It's fly-in only during the spring and summer and fall. There's a winter road that's open in the winter. 1,200 people, small isolated community. A lot of people come down to Fort McMurray and Edmonton for shopping and all those types of things. From the community of Fort Chipewyan, we have 2 missing women. One was confirmed murdered just 2 years ago. They found her remains. And there's another one that has been missing for 5-6 years now. We have another woman who is from a community that's impacted by tar sands just sort of south of Fort McMurray. Small community again, spoke to the UN about the impacts that this industry has on our communities, has gone missing as well. And so we have a disproportionate amount of people, and particularly women, that have become targets for predators that come. And these predators that come, it sounds like insidious in sort of conspiracy theorists, but the reality is the people that come to work in these sites are people that are either they have no economic development in their territory and they're just looking for anything to feed their families, and they're not doing it for the wrong reasons. They're not doing it because they're evil and insidious, but we also have people that come because they want to be a part of this, because they think it's man's domination over nature. They have no regard for these spaces or the critical need that the planet Earth and that humanity has for them. And they are sort of develop these sociopathic disconnections to humanity and its place on Earth. And the Earth is a female entity, Mother Earth. And women become a part of this disregard and this mentality. It's a really great author. His name's Jack Forbes. He wrote this book called Columbus and Other Cannibals. He wrote it in the 70s. He related cannibalism to colonialism. And what he did is he took it even one step further, because he didn't just say colonialism is a form of cannibalism, but he said that it's the Wetago disease. And so the Wetago is an Algonquin word and is the name of the spirit that is driven by greed and excess and a desire to consume, and a desire to be stronger and better and richer and more powerful than anything else. And that the Wetago eats everything in its path to gain its power. And so what we've seen in the Americas is European colonialists came to this land with the drive of conquest and to reap the material goods that were bountiful here. And they did this with a violence and a goal to consume the new world. And we saw millions, tens of millions of peoples and animals and species die. And it was all wholly justified in the name of progress and civilization. And women lost their power with the introduction and the imposition of a colonial mindset that came with patriarchy. And so in our communities, we're seeing more and more disappearances of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And I really feel like it's because we've lost that connection, that humanity has succumbed to this disease of the mind and of the soul, and that we really are experiencing an epidemic of the Wetago disease, of people being so consumed with this desire to consume, to be stronger and better and richer and more powerful than anything else. And the people that come to these camps, we sometimes see that disregard for the land also reflects into a disregard for human life. And when we live in a patriarchal, colonialistic empire such as Canada, that disregard extends even one step further to women. And so I really believe that a lot of what we're seeing is a byproduct of this disease of the mind and of the soul that is so pervasive in our culture and so dominant in our culture, that anyone that tries to challenge these things is considered like anti-development and radical leftist. And the reality is I don't think we're being radical. I think we're being logical. I think we're probably the most sound mind people that are out there.
When I was just a kid, my mommy used to sing this song. Now I've grown up to be a man, but it still lingers deep within my soul. It still lingers deep within my soul. I know the way she felt, children. I know the way she felt. Even though I'm not motherless, it makes me feel like a motherless child. Children feel like a motherless child. One day my mommy left me for a valley far away. Everyone was going, but I had to stay.
Well, the impacts of the tar sands clearly do not end at their operational boundaries. They are far-reaching and multidimensional, and I'd like to discuss the pipelines. You know, in addition to the impacts to water, soil, air, animals, and communities surrounding the Giga project, there's also the pipelines carrying the bitumen away from the oil sands, presenting a menagerie of threats to communities along their routes, including spills, water contamination, destructive infrastructure, man camps like we were talking about. And there were decisions made on 3 pipelines this past November: the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain, the Enbridge Line 3, and Northern Gateway. 2 were approved. 1 was denied, the Northern Gateway. And then there's the Keystone XL, which is intended to travel all the way to Texas, which was denied under Obama, but will be reconsidered under the Trump administration. But before we get into the Keystone XL, I'm wondering if you could explain the route of Kinder Morgan and Enbridge Line 3. And then also, what is your analysis of why the Northern Gateway was denied and the other 2 were not? Is there anything that we could learn from this?
Yeah, for sure. I think that there's a lot we can learn from a lot of these sort of new happenings, lessons to learn into the movement and where we can potentially see more successes and victories, as well as how insidious the government is at propping up another project for us to have to challenge. So first off, Kinder Morgan. The Kinder Morgan route has always been on the table. It hasn't been a new pipeline project. As long as the Northern Gateway pipeline was sort of on the table, Kinder Morgan was kind of there along with it. And so it's been kind of interesting to watch because so much attention and efforts and resources were dumped into challenging the Northern Gateway pipeline. But sort of unbeknownst to many people, we had the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which followed a very similar route to the Northern Gateway pipeline. Now, the Northern Gateway pipeline went into sort of more northern British Columbia headwaters, but this pipeline runs from just outside the city of Edmonton, where I live, and it goes through the Rocky Mountains and through the borders of Alberta and British Columbia, and then sort of travels and snakes southwards down through the territories of multiple different Indigenous communities, and through a very sort of loud and proud community of the Secwepemc people in Kamloops. And then it keeps snaking further down into ports through Vancouver, as well as into Washington State in places called Ferndale and Cordes. And so we have this sort of giant snake that comes off. And when it comes down to the end in the coastal waters, it actually grows 3 more heads and it goes to 3 more ports that will then fill up tanker traffic and ship it out to international markets that are looking for the oil in Alberta. And so that pipeline, it's not just contested by First Nations either. It's contested by mayors and municipal leaders throughout the route. And it has been since it's been proposed. And I don't remember the exact date, but it was proposed shortly after the Northern Gateway pipeline that was denied under Trudeau government. So that's one pipeline. And, we have the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, which is located in the lower mainland, British Columbia, near Vancouver, which is challenging that through legal recourse as well, under the same and very similar grounds as the Yinka Dene and the coalition of Indigenous people that challenged the Northern Gateway pipeline. And so with the Line 3 pipeline, which is the other pipeline that was approved under Trudeau, what's really interesting is that it's a replacement pipeline. And I think it's a really sort of sneaky, underhanded way in which the government is trying to make it look like they're doing the right thing. So Line 3 is already a pipeline that exists. It's also owned by Enbridge, which owned the Northern Gateway pipeline. And it's a 1,660 kilometer pipeline, which it will be the most expensive pipeline replacement project in the history of the country of Enbridge. Right now, it's almost 50 years old, and it's restricted because of its age to only about 390 barrels of oil per day. But they are going to upgrade this pipeline. They're going to make it safer and stronger and better. And then they're going to increase the capacity twofold. They're looking at a capacity of about 760,000 barrels per day. It's so insane to think about the fact that they're like, listen, we're going to do something good. There's already an existing pipeline. All the routes have been there. They've been in operation for nearly 50 years. This should be a no-brainer. We'll just fix it up. We'll put brand new walls in, and then we'll just ship 760,000 barrels of the dirtiest, most corrosive, sinking, contaminating oil that we've seen. I mean, we all know from the Kalamazoo spill that happened, was it 2010, that this oil doesn't just float on top and we skim it all away. It sinks to the bottom and it completely contaminates the ecosystem almost forever. Even the oil spill in the Gulf, if we saw a spill of tar sands at the level that we saw in the Gulf, the problems would be so much more catastrophic than what we saw in the Gulf. And we're talking about filling tankers with this oil and shipping it into coastal waters of North America and shipping it across vast oceans to other countries. Spills of this oil are going to end up with catastrophic impacts because this oil just sinks to the bottom. So, Line 3, it's going to carry the oil to Eastern Canada. It will go across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and I believe down into the United States. So it'll go into, what is the state? I'm so bad with the states. Minnesota, I believe maybe it is, or maybe it's even Montana. I can't even remember. I'm so bad. Sorry. So they're talking about having this pipeline through Canada, going east of Alberta, down through the United States to take it out to coastal waters in the U.S. Gulf and eastern United States and Canada. It's going to go to terminals in Wisconsin, then it's going to get exported even further. So we have massive pipelines that are being proposed. And these aren't just small little things. Like, we're talking about massive. Line 3 is 760,000 barrels. The Kinder Morgan, I believe, is around 800 and some thousand barrels of oil. And, close to 2 million barrels of oil per day will be exported just from these 2 pipelines that have been approved. That's just 2 pipelines that have been approved. And when I say these pipeline approvals are green lights to industry in Alberta, that it's business as usual, that's absolutely the case. And they need this, the oil and gas industry, because we've seen a massive economic crash, particularly with the price of oil. And if we can secure transportation for our oil to market, it gives the green light not just to these corporations that they can continue their operations, but they can send the signal to their shareholders that it's all great. Look, our oil is getting to market. We have buyers, we have routes. Keep investing your money. And it's not just about keeping investing our money. It's about continuing to participate in a system that locks us in to the production of fossil fuels, that locks us in to a system that continues to oppress Indigenous people, that continues to look at the environment as something that we can dominate, and that, man over nature sort of mentality. And so the approval of both of these pipelines to me is absolutely moving us in the wrong direction.
When you were talking about these pipelines breaking, I was reading that the bitumen oil is 16 times more likely to breach pipelines than conventional oil because it's 15 to 20 times more acidic than conventional oil and 7 times as viscous. So the capitalist justification of this inconceivable slaughter of flourishing ecosystems and communities is insane. And to now reconsider the Keystone XL pipeline would be completely incompatible with promises made by the government, as the Keystone XL would result in numerous treaty violations. But, because the Keystone XL would travel such a huge distance and affect so many communities, it seems that there's an opportunity for a large resistance among communities on both sides of the border. And I'm wondering, what is your experience with coalescing with resistance groups in the U.S.? And is your organization, Indigenous Climate Action, beginning to prepare for this?
Absolutely. I think that there is an urgent need to coalesce the movements of Canada and the United States. I mean, that border between Canada and the United States is arbitrary to Indigenous folks. We didn't create it. In fact, it broke up families. It broke up communities when it was imposed over 150 years ago. Canada is celebrating 150 years of being a country. And for us, it's not a celebration. There's a whole movement called Resist 150 years, because that's what we've been doing, is resisting the imposition of a colonial government and all the laws and regulations that come along with it, including the regulations to dig up oil sands and tar sands and to break up our communities and erode our rights. So when we talk about the struggles, particularly of the largest project on Earth, because of its extensions and all these pipelines that stretch out everywhere, we have to begin to coalesce our movements together, because while this pipeline is going to traverse and go through multiple different communities and compromise multiple different water sources and aquifers and sacred sites of Indigenous communities, the reality is that it's going to do that because of what's actually in the pipe. And what's in the pipe is already compromising and destroying and disrupting the water systems and sacred sites and traditional territories and species in our territory. That has already happened. It is happening right now. And if we don't connect the fact that these pipelines and these struggles of the people along those pipelines are directly related to the struggle that we are already in Alberta, we'll never win this battle. This pipeline and the Kinder Morgan pipeline and the Line 3 pipeline and the Line 9 pipeline and every other pipeline that's being proposed that's associated with this project is a part of a project that has already been sanctioned as okay, that has already been given the green light to continue, that is already disturbing and disrupting and contaminating and destroying the lives of Indigenous communities. We have to start talking about stopping these projects at the source, because what we've seen with Trump is he's demonstrated exactly what I have always felt would happen, that you cannot cut off the head of the beast of Hydra, because when you cut off one of its heads, another one pops back up, or a new head grows exactly from that same place that you just cut it off. And when we just talk about pipelines as an individual insulated thing, we're doing no better than reviewing projects as insulated individual projects. We have to look at the cumulative and the larger struggle. And that larger struggle comes from the development of tar sands, but even bigger than that struggle, it comes from the institutional racism that has erased Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' rights, and humanity's connections to the land and the environment, and our space and our place as humanity in a finite ecosystem on Mother Earth. If we don't come back to those realizations of who we are and our places on this planet, if we don't respect Indigenous ideology and cosmology and rights and culture, we're always going to see projects like the tar sands, whether it's tar sands in Canada, tar sands in Venezuela, tar sands in the Congo, whether it's fracked gas or fracked oil in the Bakken oil fields, until we address the systemic issues that have allowed us to sanction these types of projects, that have allowed us to mute the voices of the Indigenous communities that have said no, we'll never win these battles. We have to stop these projects at the source by challenging the systems of entrenched white supremacy, entrenched colonial imperialistic attitudes that have looked at Indigenous communities as not being able to take care of themselves, not being able to look after themselves. I mean, give me a break. Indigenous people in Canada were the last human people allowed and granted the right to vote in 1960. It wasn't until 1960 that our people were allowed to vote. And when we talk about all these different movements, the environmental movement, women's rights, and the feminist movement, those movements were moving along and forward without us because they never included our voice. And it's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that we've seen a recognition of Indigenous peoples as real critical voices in both the movements for women's rights and the movements to protect the environment. And that's really sad. We have a long way to go to understand that it's not just about protecting the environment for white dominant society or upholding the rights of women in white dominant society, that there are more insidious things going on in the underpinnings that have allowed things like the psychosis of the development of Alberta's tar sands, or the psychosis of the development of fracked gas or fracked oil in the Bakken oil fields. We have to start addressing the root causes. Otherwise, we're never going to win these battles. And so for me, I think we have a lot of lessons to learn. We won the Northern Gateway Pipeline, we got it disapproved or taken off the table. It was denied because they did that. They succeeded in doing something that has never been done, which is to prove unequivocally that these projects have irreversible impacts on the environment, irreversible impacts on Indigenous people's rights, and that people didn't want it. We had so much concerted effort around that project in this country that we won. And we had the same thing in the United States with the Keystone XL. But the problem is the oil is still being produced. The oil is still looking for a way to get out. And if we don't address that issue of why that oil is still being produced and still being allowed to be produced, we're always going to have more pipelines to keep fighting.
There's a crow flying, talking ragged tree to tree. He's black as the highway that's leading me. Now he's diving down to pick up on something shiny. I feel like that black crow flying in a blue sky. I took a ferry to the highway, then I drove to a pontoon plane. I took a plane to a taxi and a taxi to a train. I've been traveling so long. How am I ever gonna know my home when I see it again? I'm like a black crow flying domination, corruption.
Thank you so much for connecting those dots, that we need to stop the issue at the source, at the root, whether it's the actual area where the oil is being produced or the systemic environmental racism. There will be no environmental justice without Indigenous rights, without social justice, and we can't just compartmentalize these different issues. You know, there's an undeniable conflict between the way industrial growth society conditions us to see the world and the way that traditional cultures know the earth. Colonial forces continue to persist when holistic ways of knowing the world are forced into a reductionist box, commodifying living organisms, air, and water. So, what has your experience been in bridging the gap between these two worlds? Do you see a better way to integrate traditional ecological knowledge into climate change discussions and solutions?
One of the things that we saw within the environmental movement and why we saw so much attention and resources put into pipelines is that we were like, oh, okay, well, we need to make people understand that tar sands are really bad and we need to bring it home to them. And we could do that by making them realize that the pipelines are in their own backyards and that the whole country is going to be impacted by them. The whole continent is going to be impacted by them. At the beginning of this sort of movement, which was over a decade ago now, people weren't talking about climate change. But now, 2015, even 2009 in Copenhagen, we saw the world arguing, but there was still a lot of people on the fence around climate change, but they were trying to come to an agreement to address climate in 2009 in Copenhagen. You fast forward to 2015 in Paris, and finally the world all agrees climate change is happening, it's real, we need to do something about it. So we have this new tool in our toolkit that we don't just need to use pipelines as a way to bring these industrialization and fossil fuel projects into the backyards of regular everyday Americans or Canadians. But we have climate change, and climate change is unequivocally undeniable. The science is out. 97% of the world scientific community believes climate change is real, and the other 3% are questionable in their arguments to counter it. So we have this sort of tool that we should be mobilizing around to be like, we need to be moving away from these things. But we're doing this really weird thing. As we're rushing to address the climate crisis, we're doing it within the confines of this ideology rooted in this form of cannibalism and colonialism still. So instead of trying to find ways to stop what we've done to become the most powerful nations on the planet, we still are holding on to that power. We're not letting go because we have this disease, this wheat-to-go disease, and we've commodified everything. And now we're even commodifying the atmosphere through these prescribed carbon market mechanisms and conservation offsets, cap and trade systems that do nothing to actually challenge the structural violence that has got us to where we are. And it allows us, these governments and systems, to keep furthering this cannibalization of the planet. In Jack Forbes' book, one of the things he says is that the tragic characteristics of the wheat-to-go psychosis is that it spreads partly by resistance to it. That is, those who try to fight the wheat-to-go sometimes in order to survive adopt the wheat-to-go values. And so this idea that there's this sort of mentality that has perpetuated and is permeating through society that we cannot survive without progress. And progress is defined within the parameters of economic growth, personal wealth, personal gain. And therefore, we continue to cannibalize this planet, even though we see that climate change and all the science and all the numbers is pointing that we are literally walking towards the cliff's edge. And instead of saying stop, people are just happily marching towards the edge and letting this sort of brigade of people take us on our merry way towards the end of humanity. And so I think that the only people that I've really seen challenge wholly, and not just with, we just need to shift to something that's a little bit better, that still lives and works within the confines of the structures of cannibalism and colonialism, are Indigenous folks. Indigenous folks are ready. They're ready for something completely new. because the systems that have allowed us to create this wholly psychotic place in which humanity has gotten to, and climate change is a symptom of it, they're willing to say, no, we just have to stop everything because these systems don't work. And they were living in North America. Our people, Indigenous peoples, we have been living in North America for thousands and thousands of years with never taking things to the tipping point. And that's because Indigenous peoples' ideology, cosmology, their culture, their identity is intrinsically linked to the land and the spaces. It recognizes that we are just a part of the system, that we are interconnected to it. When colonization came, it didn't just come and kill the Indians and take up the resources. It came here and it erased Indigenous ideology. It didn't even just erase it, it demonized it. It poisoned it against everyone who held on to it. We were heathens, we were nothing, we were nobodies. But now as we are coming back, it's like full circle. Because as we start to talk about climate change solutions, where are those solutions coming from? Coming from a realization of interconnectedness, permaculture, regionally based climate solutions to address trash and composting and energy and passive solar energy. And these are life systems that work holistically. And as an Indigenous person, they respect the ideologies of Indigenous peoples, those ideologies that were attempted to be erased by the imposition of colonization. The fact that I know that in 2017 is a testament to the resilience of Indigenous folks to hold on to that knowledge because it was so intrinsically important, not just to maintaining our identities as individuals, but the identity of humanity. And so I think traditional ecological knowledge and having that understanding and that rooted and that grounded foundation of what humanity is going to be critical to building real solutions to address the climate crisis in which we're in, and to building real solutions, not just to climate change, but to the inequality and to the sort of systems of oppression that have gotten us and allowed us to even be in a place where we have to talk about climate change.
Goodness, thank you so much for that amazing response and this truth that we need to decolonize the environmental movement. And I'm wondering, on a tangible level, how can people who are involved in the environmental movement, how do we move beyond the surface, dismantle the power structures within and start actually supporting Indigenous climate leadership?
I think there's absolutely ways for people to begin on a path of real reconciliation with Indigenous folks. But, one of the things that I find troubling is that I get a little triggered by that question sometimes, because it makes me feel like the way that the government puts the burden of proof on Indigenous communities to prove that they were impacted. It's like now we're being asked to prove to the environmental movement folks why we're valuable partners. I think that it needs to be put back on you. It needs to be put back on the environmental movement. Why do you think that we're valuable partners? Why do you think we should be included in your movement? How do we work in your movement? Because we have been trying in Canada for 150 years to be part of the system, part of the structures. We signed treaty. Our leaders signed treaty in our countries because we wanted to work in partnership with the colonial governments. They did that because that's what they thought they were doing. But for 150 years, we have been left out, we've been marginalized, we've been sidelined. And that same marginalization and sidelining of Indigenous peoples within the structures of the colonial government of Canada have permeated and perpetuated within the environmental movement. Within the feminist movement, within all of those movements, we've been dehumanized. And now, as we move into this place of truth and reconciliation, as they call it in Canada, or this awakening of decolonization within North America and the world over, there's still this hesitancy of people being like, well, how do we work with you? And again, that burden of proof is always being put on the Indigenous folks to prove how our rights should be utilized, prove how we should work within the movement. And so I throw it back. I think it's time for the environmental movement to dig deep in themselves and to look at, where is your privilege? Where is your power? Where are you doing right? Where are you doing wrong? Where can you fix these things? Where can you create those spaces? Where can you see Indigenous peoples that have been fighting for the protection of their lands and territories for hundreds of years in the Americas, over 500 years in the Americas? Where do they fit into your movements? We have to think about not simply addressing the climate and saving the environment and switching our energy systems from oil and gas to solar and wind. It's about pushing back against these systems of colonialism, capitalism, oppression, imperialism, all of these things that are grounded in systems that support white supremacy. That is one of the biggest problems in this country. And I think we need to start talking about it. It's going to require an undoing of these sick ideologies created on that foundation. And we need to start creating room for new foundations of ideas that respect the values of those that hold original instructions or Indigenous peoples. You know, we have to become woke. We have to become conscious, because that's the only way that we can begin to undo the process in which we are currently in. I also just want to say one more thing, like an indication of where we are. Luther Standing Bear, Land of the Spotted Eagle, stated that we did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and the winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested by wild animals and savage people. To us, it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery. Not until the hairy man from the east came, and with brutal frenzy heaped injustices upon us and the families we loved, was it wild for us. And so that, to me, is you take that and you hold on to that as people within the climate movement and think about that. This has never been a wild space to us. This has been home. And don't you think that you would want to work with the people that consider this home? Don't you think that they should be the core of the work that you do?
Wow, Eriel, thank you so much. I think it is an immensely important understanding that non-Indigenous people in North America need to take it upon themselves to not only educate themselves on the history of colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy, but also to understand their privileges and take it upon themselves to do the deep inner work to then be able to make the tangible outer changes that need to happen to protect not just humans, but all the species that we share this incredible earth with. And I'm just absolutely blown away and so grateful for your life's work and your clarity on these complex topics. And I would love to lead people to indigenousclimateaction.com, which is your website. And if you'd like to just, to wrap up the interview, let people know about your organization and how they could become involved.
Yeah, so Indigenous Climate Action is taking a lot of what we've talked about Indigenous people as being agents of change in the time where we're dealing with the climate crisis. And sorely and sadly, Indigenous people haven't been really involved in the discourse of building solutions to address the climate crisis that we're in. So Indigenous Climate Action was born out of this idea that we need to support Indigenous communities. It's an Indigenous-led organization to support Indigenous communities building climate change solutions for themselves and being a part of the larger climate change solutions discourse. We've held a few meetings. We're beginning to build toolkits for Indigenous communities to have a better understanding of climate change and climate change literacy in their communities, to build those solutions and connect communities that are already taking the steps to address climate change within their own local regions. You can check it out at indigenousclimateaction.com. You can sign up to our newsletter. We also have a blog where we update people and stay informed. And of course, we're a nonprofit organization, always looking for support. So please do give us a donate and click on our donate button.
Wonderful. Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was Willie Dunn, I Pity the Country, then The Wailers, Where Is My Mother, Joni Mitchell with Black Crow, and our theme music is Silence Returns by Bo and Kate Wolf with Like a River. The show is produced and edited by myself and March Young, and thanks to our research director, Madison Mogolski. With spring upon us, the 1 Million Redwood Project is on the rise. Next month, we are starting the earthworks, ponds, and nursery build. Also, the Tongass Filming Campaign are picking up momentum with the short film almost complete. This summer, I will hit the road showing the film at festivals and speaking at gatherings and events along the West Coast. We have 2 more webinars coming up for the Spring Sisters Bonded in Action series with Malia Holman and Heather Lightning on direct action from the grassroots, and then Joanna Macy on staying sane and active amid mass psychosis. Please join us and bring your comments and questions to these workshops on the web. Stay tuned to the podcast and check out forthewild.world for updates on all of this and more. And please consider donating. Your financial contribution directly supports the reforestation of redwoods and their plant, fungal, and salmon communities. Until next time.